And so, as I said, which you didn't hear, my name is Jolene Eagle-King. I am the Rural Projects Coordinator here at the Sexual Violence and Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I wanted to just walk through a couple of quick logistics. So, as you might have noticed, our phones are muted. Mine was not meant to be muted, and I'm glad that we got that figured out very quickly. And I know that a few of you have now taken some time to chat things in, but we'd like you to just take a moment, say hello, say maybe what state or territory you're from, and maybe just a little bit about the weather. Here in Minnesota, it is a gray but very nice day at the same time. So just so you can get in the habit of chatting things in, because we really want this to try to be as interactive as we can, even in this format. So if you could once again chat in your name, where you might be at, and a little bit about what the weather might be. The webinar is going to be recorded, and once it is captioned, we will be sending out all the materials to both the recorded webinar and any other materials that we might be discussing today, and that should be going out as soon as we're able to get things captioned. And that is really all that I have for you, and now I'm going to turn you over to my wonderful colleague, friend, and supervisor, Johnanna Gams, to talk to you a little bit about her experience.
Oh my gosh, there's so many folks coming in so quickly. So Oklahoma, Georgia, Kansas, we got Nebraska, Medford. Fun fact, I was born in Medford, Wisconsin. Woo, at the Medford Hospital. We got Michigan and Minnesota and South Dakota, more from Wisconsin, Arizona, more from Michigan. Hi, everyone. It is so lovely to see all of you here. We are so excited. Gosh, we got folks from all over the place, and that is really exciting and really cool, especially because this is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. Just kidding. You folks hear me say that all the time, that things are my favorite things to talk about. This topic in particular is very special to me. I was a new coordinator, which I should hold on so you can see my face. Hello, this is me. I was a new coordinator when I joined my team. So my team had been coming together and meeting together for a number of years. And so I stepped in as the third coordinator on their team. And so that transition was both beautiful and challenging all at the same time. And so I really love talking about this topic with people because there's so much opportunity and so much possibility when you're stepping in as the new kid in town, so to speak. So just a little bit about me. So I am the Sexual Violence Justice Institute Director here at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I'm also a former SART coordinator, and I have been with MINCASA for a little under 3.5 years now, doing various work, but always focused on SARTs. So for those of you, if you're here, you probably already know who FCJI is, but just a lightning fast rundown to make sure that you all know who's talking to you. The Sexual Violence Justice Institute is a project of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We are a TA provider for both state and national programs. This one is underneath our rural National Technical Assistance Program, which, as Jolene said, she is the lead on. So we're a TA provider, and we do work to support communities in creating systems change in our sexual violence response. And we really believe in the idea that SARTs are housed within communities, and that in order to really, truly create systems change, we have to be connecting our SARTs back to community, and most importantly, focusing our work on how do we help victim survivors find healing and justice? How do we help those who perpetrate get access to both accountability and rehabilitation? And how do we ultimately then create safer communities as a direct result of making systemic change through being on a SART? So that's who FCJI is in a nutshell. So whenever you need help with SART-related matters, we are always here to talk to you and provide you whatever we can. And we also are really great at providing referrals when we're not the right subject matter expert for your issue, and we will help you get there. So with that, that's me. Just a couple of areas for focus for the webinar. So we want to make sure that our intent is really clear for all of you from all over the U.S., which is so, again, I am just always so thrilled that so many folks come and are able to be here with us today, and even more folks who are listening to the recording after the fact. So for today, our webinar is going to be talking about the overview of the work of a systems change SART. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but there are two major types of SARTs, and we're really going to focus on what systems change SARTs can do today. We are also going to talk a little bit about what is the actual role of a coordinator, because what we know from experience is that so many people are doing so many different things as coordinators. So we're going to just talk a little bit about what that really looks like. We are also going to discuss some ideas and strategies to help a new coordinator join an existing team. This is an overwhelming and vast majority of a lot of coordinators. Of course, there's a whole bunch of folks who are brand new coordinators. You can absolutely take some of this work and apply it. And if you need more ideas, assistance, and resources, who do you call? That's copyright infringement. Ignore that. Call Jolene is the point here. Call the Sexual Violence Justice Institute staff here at the Minnesota Coalition. And we can help you work through it. And then finally, it's really important to understand that this is not going to be an in-depth conversation about SART 101, or as I like to say, getting started, which Jolene worked in for me later in this presentation, which I super value because I love puns. We're not going to talk a lot about meeting logistics, and we're not going to talk about guarantees that this will fix all of your challenges and barriers and also strengths. This is really just a set of ideas and conversations. We're also going to want to hear from you. And so for those of you who are like, I'm definitely going to check my email while also listening to a webinar, while also filling out paperwork, we might be in for a little bit more of an interactive ride. So if you're ready and willing, we can get going on the interaction part. You've already had some practice. So we would like to know, to help us make sure we're framing up the conversation, what is one question you have as you begin your work with your team? So I'm going to put us on pause and mute for just a second. So for about 30 seconds, you're going to hear silence as we wait for you all to chat in your questions, or maybe you have a comment or an idea or something you're working through. Really, what's burning on your mind as you begin your work? So go ahead and chat in. We'll fall silent for just a few seconds. Ooh, they're coming in fast. Okay, so most effective methods to encourage collaboration. Yes, collaboration is one of our top 5 conversation points. You ask folks to share changes within their agency to make the team aware. A little nervous to take this on, but you would love to learn and educate yourself about what you can and cannot do during SART meetings. How do you grow a relationship between existing SANEs? These are all great questions. I'm going to give it just a few more seconds to see if anyone else has questions or ideas or anything that they want to see addressed or as they're getting work done. Okay, so I see how to get buy-in from law enforcement. So I see a couple of areas of relationship building and buy-in. Those are really common things that we get here through our technical assistance. These are things we often end up talking about frequently with team coordinators as well as the people who support teams. So, oh my gosh, that is probably the question that burns at my heart, deepest heart of hearts. How do you make SART meetings meaningful and sustainable? That is a great question. These are amazing questions. Thank you so much. Again, the question about buy-in and attendance for prosecution. Yes, absolutely. I think we'll touch on most of this, and if by the end we don't get to your question, we're going to reserve time for people to be able to chat in questions, and we can talk a little bit about maybe some specifics that you're looking for. And of course, after we're done here today, you can always do what? Call us, because that's what we do as our jobs, and we really like our jobs. So, I see a couple more law enforcement buy-in, improving communication, effective ways to follow up that systems change implementation is happening. Oh, yes. Tips on how to best review cases and SART meetings, improve collaboration and interaction with parties working with victim survivors. Okay, perfect. You can continue to throw anything else in there. I'll have Jolene monitor the chat for me, and that way we can get going with maybe answering some of these really great questions. All right, here it is. The pun has arrived. Getting started with a team. Let's briefly go over some foundational information to make sure that we're all speaking from the same place. So if you are a SART expert already and you already know SART foundations, this is totally your time to go look at your email and work through your paperwork. Just kidding. You should probably stay on with us because you might have expertise you can share with others. So let's talk about SART 101. So SART can mean a lot of things. And over the last 3.5 years here at MnCASA and working for the SCJI team, I have heard so many different definitions. But at the heart, what we're really talking about are sexual assault response teams. Now, you may be thinking, wow, I have a different name. We are the Sexual Assault Protocol Team. We are the Sexual Assault Interagency Council. We are fill in the blank with a whole bunch of different acronyms. At the end of the day, what makes you a SART is some of the following things rather than your name. It is about having multidisciplinary representatives all around the same table. And it's really important that they come with those differing views, approaches, constraints, and experiences. So we saw a lot of questions about relationship building and buy-in, and I don't know about you, but as a SART leader, I sometimes looked at the multidisciplinary aspect with all those differing views, approaches, constraints, and experiences, and found a deep amount of frustration with it. And once I moved through my frustration, I saw the incredible power of having those differing views, approaches, and constraints and experiences when you can channel them into like a way to build something together. And so that multidisciplinary representative really, really matters. And by having all those different providers, you are able to really devote yourselves to changing the sexual violence response in your communities. And so that's perhaps the most important thing that a SART can do, is actually make change to the sexual violence response. We're not going to bore you with the typical statistics, even though I at heart would love to do that for hours. But what we know is that our sexual violence response, especially in our communities, it's not as strong as we would generally like it to be. And the statistics bear that out pretty broadly. So SARTs are powerful, powerful strategies for change. The SART is focused on collaboration and systems change. And so we use the word collaboration pretty intentionally. And we differentiate here at SCJI at MnCASA, we differentiate between cooperation, coordination, and collaboration, right? Because cooperation is really low-level connection and buy-in. It's maybe like you're putting in a few resources, but you're generally doing your own thing. There's not necessarily a shared mission or vision. There might be a shared outcome. With coordination, you might have a little bit of shared mission and vision. You are definitely working toward a similar outcome. You might put in a little bit more time, effort, and resources, but at the end of the day, you might disband after you've coordinated to complete your project. We talk about SARTs as collaborative efforts, where you are going all in together. You have developed a shared mission and vision and understanding. We'll talk about how you do that as a new coordinator here in a little bit, so just hang tight. And through that deep-level collaboration, where you're really experiencing barriers and successes together through a common framework, that's how we get to our systems change. And when we say systems change, we're talking about 4 main areas. And we'll get to that again in just a minute, because I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. So SARTs are those who are focused on collaboration and systems change. Importantly, we are working to improve outcomes for all victim survivors. And I think it's really important to note that we are fighting to change the response for all victim survivors. That includes folks who traditionally are not getting great services or don't feel like they have access to services. Having worked in a number of rural communities and having grown up and lived in rural communities for most of my life, when we talk about working for marginalized or underserved groups of victim survivors, I often hear people say, we don't have those kinds of folks here. And of course, we know that you probably do. And so how do we build better outcomes for every single person who's experienced sexual violence in our communities? That's the heart of what SARTs do. And then last but not least, the SCJI model really says that SARTs need to use a continuous improvement model. And we're going to talk about what that can look like. But before we talk about the Sexual Violence Justice Institute's model, I really just want to emphasize, it doesn't matter what continuous improvement model that you use. If you use what we call the phases of systems change, that's delightful. We'd love to walk you through that. If you find a different systems change and continuous improvement model works for you, awesome. As long as you continue doing the work, and at no point does your team say, I think we're good. We're okay with it. And so if our model doesn't work for you, go research one that does, and we're still happy to help you and talk through any issues you might have. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a SART. So systems change SARTs, they're really focusing on big and deep level changes. And so the two main SARTs that we have as far as SART types go is acute response SARTs, so folks who are responding to immediate or urgent cases of sexual violence, or the systems change SARTs. They're meeting outside of crisis or emergency. They're looking at all cases within a given community, and they're really talking about institutionalizing change at agency, policy, systems, procedures, and individual practice. So that's what we're talking about today. So the phases of systems change process consists of three major phases. You can see the symbol on the right-hand side of the screen. So you see we have the assessing of the status quo, making change, measuring change. And you can see that each one of these don't have a definitive end because that is a continuous improvement model. And when I first stepped into being a SART coordinator, I saw lovingly looked at me and said, correct. Uh-oh, it looks like folks have lost audio.
I'm not sure how that's happened. Oh, there we go.
Is it back? Are we back?
Oh, our cord just got a little jiggled, so we apologize about that.
Oh boy. Where do I need to repeat from?
Let's
talk about systems. So systems change. When I first started becoming a SART coordinator, I had a technical assistant who worked here at SCJM in CASA, and I was just flabbergasted. I was like, wait, we're never done. There's no point that we ever get to be like, hey, we're finished with our work as a team. And she just very lovingly looked at me and said, absolutely not. And so at first it was a little disheartening, but then it became a sort of real empowerment of, wow, okay, so we're never going to really be done. What radical work can we do together? So here's one model of how you do that. So first and foremost, you start with assessing your status quo. And all this phase really is learning about the current response and experience. And so when we say experience, we're not just talking about the experience of service providers. We're talking about the experience of victim survivors. We're talking about community-based experience. We're talking about a lot. Under assessing the status quo, you might do things like take time to assess what actual services are available. It's important to really look at stuff like that every couple of years because, as we all know, especially in the nonprofit and social service world, our services regularly have to change because of funding. And so part of your assessing the status quo could be taking a community service provider's assessment and say, what is here? You might ask your service providers, what's going on for you? What challenges, barriers, right? And you take that time to really get grounded in the work of your community. The next step that you're going to move to is then making change. So I like to shorten the ASQ to ask because I think that summarizes best what it is. So during the making the change phase, you are going to use the information you learned from your assessing your status quo to target your improvements. This is absolutely critical. It is really important that you take the time to learn outside of your own experience because what happens with so many teams is they come together, they form, and they're like, we got this, we know what has to change. And then they might make a bunch of changes that weren't informed by what victim survivors need, wasn't informed by what other service providers need, it wasn't informed by what the community needed. And so then we end up with changes that weren't what they needed, that might have unintended consequences we didn't plan on. And so that's why during the Make the Change, we're really using what we learned through a rigorous process to be able to say, here's what we're going to do differently. And then, da-da-da, you already know this because you see the image, we go to measuring the change. You're going to take time to check the effectiveness and the outcome of the changes you have made during the Make the Change and based on your assessing the status quo. Through exploring the effectiveness and outcome, you actually get the opportunity to find new areas of exploration, because it is a rare moment in life when we get to look back and say, okay, did what we change, did it work for us? And then as you're looking and saying, okay, how did it work? What did it work like? What were some of the consequences, unintended, positive, negative? What was all of it? It's pretty rare that you don't find somewhere new that you're like, oh, wow, we actually need to make some edits over here based on this new change. So then you go to measuring of the change, and that's when you start again. You might find that new area needs a really short assessing of the status quo to figure out what's going on there, right? And then you make that change, then you measure that change, and it just keeps going, just like that. So that's one model of continuous improvement. We have found it to work pretty well for most teams. Again, you can find a different one and use it, and we will still absolutely work with you. This is just one that we already have quite a few resources on, and we're happy to share with you. So next, let's talk about systems change, targets, and questions. So it's really important to understand when we're talking about systems change, we're actually talking about these 4 purpose areas up on the screen. So we're talking about individual practice. We are talking about agency policy. We're talking about systems procedure, and finally, interagency collaboration. So individual practice is pretty easy, so I'll just breeze through it. It is the actions that every single service provider who has contact with a victim survivor of sexual violence, what they do on the ground. So it's not what's written in agency policy. It's not what's written in the agency training. It's what do you individually do? What does your coworker, your peer, what do they do? What do they say? How do they act? How do they hold their body? That's individual practice. When we're looking at agency policy, we're truly looking at what is the written record and document of what your agency is telling you are supposed to do as a service provider. Because oftentimes we see that policies might have been written a couple of years ago and aren't current with the times. They don't meet current need. They might have been written based on a grant that's gone now. There's a lot that changes with policy, and so we want to look at how we are structuring ourselves. We also want to look at systems procedures. So this one is often a little bit harder for folks to grasp until I give it a little explanation. So systems procedures are any of those big processes that impact multiple agencies. So for example, you might be working on agency policy of one law enforcement jurisdiction who sits on your SART. You might actually have 12 law enforcement jurisdictions that respond to your service area. So how are you making sure that there is consistency across all law enforcement jurisdictions within those procedures to make sure that no matter where anybody enters, no matter what agency, so they could go to any advocacy agency in your area, they could go to any law enforcement jurisdiction, they could go to any hospital, and they would get similar quality services. That's what systems procedures really focuses on. How do we impact those really big, large systems and not just the individual agencies that are a part of those systems? And then finally, interagency collaboration. We've already talked a little bit about the importance, but truly, interagency collaboration is key. Again, I'm not sure how many of this applies to. I have a feeling it's more than a few. But when we're thinking about connections and communities, usually within a SART, we typically find that somebody somewhere has an agency that their agency doesn't speak to, or they have one agency practitioner, some individual, that they don't speak to any other individual from that other place because something happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and that relationship is broken down. We've also talked with folks that maybe that event that broke down collaboration happened 6 months ago, and it's still really new and raw. That's why when we're talking about systems change, we have to look at how we are meaningfully collaborating on behalf of victim survivors. And whenever we're doing systems change, if you had to break it down to just handful of questions in these topic areas, all we're ever really asking is, what can we do better? Because that's part of continuous improvement work in SART. We know that we have to do things better. There's always room and opportunity for improvement. Where can we reinforce our strengths? Because again, there is always a strength. I always joke with the teams that I work with and say, you're probably not my crap unicorn. Because sometimes when I talk with communities, they say, we're not doing a single thing right. Not one thing is good. We don't have one single strength. And whenever I push back just a little bit, I say, really? Nothing. You are truly a 1 in a million unicorn that's just crappy. That's when people are going to say, well, you know, we do have this one thing. And that's where we have to look. What are we doing well, and how do we hold tight to that as a way to leverage our commitment, our dedication, and our efforts to improve outcomes for victim survivors? And then finally, the last question that we're really asking when we're talking about systems change is, how can we take action based on our knowledge? And it's really important that our knowledge comes from deep listening, learning, and reflection from the communities that we serve. So, okay, we covered all of the SART basics in like about 20 minutes. So hopefully you're feeling set, ready to go, and ready to talk about, coordination and being a coordinator. So let's get going on talking about what it means to be a SART coordinator. And let's start by talking about what's your role as the team's coordinator. So what we're going to give you is, again, a general framework. If you're listening to us and you're like, oh, that's not me at all, that's cool. You're probably doing your thing right, too. We're giving you the framework of what we see as most typically the coordinator's role. So first and foremost, we know that the coordinator generally is trying to serve the voice and the voices of all people who are present. So when we're thinking about where the team coordinator's quote-unquote allegiance, so those are real big air quotes, where the allegiance lies, it's really to the team itself. And so whenever the SART coordinator is speaking, they should really be speaking as the voice of all. And that means you got to be a little bit neutral. And typically when I say, hey, you have to be neutral, most coordinators give me a little bit of pushback and they're like, I'm not neutral, I'm very passionate about the subject. To which I say, lovely, that is absolutely 100% okay. When we're talking about neutral, what we're talking about is that you are not present advocating strongly for any one discipline. You're not there to push somebody's agenda. Because I have worked with a number of coordinators who are like, oh, my direct supervisor says that I have to try to push this through the SART team, even though that's not where they want to go. Like that kind of stuff, that's where you need to be neutral. And that means you're not just neutral, you're invested. And you should be invested. And so if you're jumping onto a new team and you're like, all right, let's do this, that's perfect. You're right where you need to be. You just need to also be asking yourself, how and where are you ensuring that you're not representing a single discipline? Now, for those of you who are in rural communities, I can't tell you the number of teams that have talked to me about, and team coordinators that have talked about, that they don't get to be the neutral voice because they're actually present as advocacy. They're actually present as their prosecutor's office. They're actually present as a law enforcement representative, right? That's one of those times and places that you're really going to want to think about, how can you ensure that there is balance and ensure that you are marking when you're speaking as the SART coordinator, who's supposed to be neutral, and when are you speaking as an agency or discipline representative. And so it's going to sound goofy, but I actually make this recommendation quite a bit. Actually just say it. So when you're in a meeting and something's coming up, you can say as a coordinator, hey, I'm here also as law enforcement's perspective, and so I'm going to be speaking from that position right now. And then when you're done there, you can say, great, I'm going to move back into being the team coordinator. That kind of clarity is absolutely crucial to that investment, because sometimes if folks think that you're playing dual roles, they start to believe that you are not actually the voice of all. And that can cause a lot of struggles with buy-in, engagement, and sustainability. So Get clever, get creative. I'm certain you are already both. And start finding those ways that you can be that neutral but invested party for your team. Another major role within the team coordinator's purview is to provide leadership. Again, this is one of those areas that people say like, oh, I'm not a leader, I'm not into telling people what to do, right? That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about team leadership. What we're talking about when we're talking about that your job is team leadership is that you are providing direction to your team in some way, shape, or form, right? We're talking about that you are keeping your mission, your team's mission, core and central to every activity you undertake. And it's really important, if y'all don't have a mission, come talk to Jolene and or myself, but mostly Jolene because she's the role projects coordinator. We have mission development worksheets and information that we're happy to provide to you. So keep that mission core. That's the role of a leader, is saying, does this fit where we're trying to go? And also a big part of leadership is really being able to see the bigger picture, that you can look at all the work that's happening in the weeds and you can see that bird's eye view and say, okay, how do we get where we need to go together? The next thing that can come up as part of your role is the importance of facilitation. So I truly love facilitation. I really enjoy helping meetings run on time and on schedule and purpose. And that's really a lot of what the facilitation aspect is. So it is running meetings, making sure they start on time, it's making sure they end on time. It's also about designing a process that ensures every single person on your team has an opportunity to participate. That was actually one of the hardest lessons I've ever had as a SART coordinator. I had a number of folks who were on my team who did not actively speak up in the large group meetings, and I had a lovely, lovely human being who finally just pulled me aside and said, do you know why these groups are not speaking? It's because they're representing marginalized communities, they are folks of color, and part of the cultural tradition is that they do not speak unless they're asked questions directly. So every time you ask this large group question like you do every meeting, they are not answering because it is not within their cultural norms of how they answer questions. And of course, at first I was like, no, of course I didn't mean that. What about my intent over my impact, right? I panicked a little bit, but after I sat with it for a couple of days, I realized that my facilitation had to change to make sure I truly could design a process in which all voices could be heard. And so that started to include things like anonymous feedback opportunities, inviting specific people to give me their feedback. If they didn't talk in a meeting, I'd make sure to follow up with them and say, hey, I'm so glad you came to the meeting. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Would you please call me or email me and let me know what you're thinking? Right? I had to change that facilitation in order to make sure I could really, truly get all disciplines involved and make sure all participants felt like I was facilitating a meeting that they could be present in. And so that's really key. It's also about helping people keep focused, because I don't know about all y'all, but pretty much every meeting I'm in, we somehow start to lose focus at some point. So part of facilitation is just being able to wrangle people back and get them focused again. And then another major piece to your role as the team coordinator is coordination. So spoiler alert, it's in the name. And really what that is around is about planning, logistics, documentation, and things like how do you orient new team members? How do you make sure that when folks are leaving that they're giving enough information to be able to orient those team members? Where are you meeting? How often are you meeting? Who's writing the agenda? All of that kind of stuff is so, so critical to the role of the coordinator, and it's housed within the bucket of coordination. And then our last major aspect of what we see as the team coordinator's role and what we see most often and what we kind of recommend is providing vision and planning. So really being able to see those bigger goals and help the team clarify what those bigger goals are. How do you develop action plans to make sure you can achieve those goals. One of the biggest stumbling blocks we see is people talk about creating goals and then they don't make an actual action plan to go with it. So they don't have clear step-by-step of who's responsible for doing what and when. That kind of vision and planning is critical to your SART meetings becoming meaningful and sustainable. Because when people feel like they're there for a purpose, when they see forward momentum, when they have clear tasks that they get to accomplish and then celebrate those accomplishments, human motivation is very typical in that they actually feel more excited to do more work together. So holding folks to their agreements, having folks be part of that visioning and planning, and being able to, you as the coordinator, see those things through are absolutely important. Now, with all of that said, I think it's also really important to acknowledge some of you might not feel empowered to do that on your team. Sometimes you might have different facilitation models. We'll actually talk about that in a little bit as ideas and strategies for you to be able to get into your team in a meaningful way. The key thing is a coordinator is not supposed to show up and tell everybody what to do. That's probably not a great coordinator, right? But a coordinator is supposed to be able to provide direction, leadership, be the voice of all. It's supposed to be doing all of those things and helping the team move forward through meaningful systems change. So, again, if you have any questions or you want to talk through some of this, give us a call. We're happy to help you figure it out together. All right, so let's talk about what it looks like to step into and have the steps you can take into leading an existing team. So we've broken it down into 3 major areas. This is actually really reflective of the phases of systems change. Originally, we didn't design it that way, but as we were talking through some of these key lessons, Jolene very smartly pointed out to me, this actually follows our systems change model. So guess what? It's continuous improvement on a coordinator's level. So we start with the top by going with learn, then we develop, and then we reflect. Before I jump too far into this, I just want to pause. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to chat into the chat box about the content we've so far covered? I'm going to pause for 30 seconds and just see if anyone has anything that they want me to address before we move forward. So you're going to hear a little bit of silence on the line. Okay, we paused for questions. I don't see any questions. I'm going to go ahead and assume it's because I have absolutely crystal clarity on everything I've said so far. But if you do have questions, as a reminder, please feel free to chat into that. So let's talk about first step first, the learning process. So this is truly the your goal is to learn first and foremost. And it's not just because it follows the phases of systems change. It is absolutely critical as a new coordinator to an existing team that you take the time to really understand what's happening on that team, because shakeups can be really, really hard on a team. So I know, so just like really normalizing this for everyone, and this is true of most of the new coordinators to existing teams I've talked to, people are like ready to go, super excited about their new job and their new role, and they're just going to jump in and like start at it. We highly, highly recommend against that. I also made that mistake in my first team meeting, and it went over like a sack of bricks. And that's actually pretty common for most teams because the established team has a whole bunch of stuff already happening for them. And that transition time without a coordinator can often be really hard on a team. So first things first is to learn from your team and their community agencies, as well as anyone else who's willing to talk to you about it. So first and foremost, you got to learn the team's history, and that's really specific. You want to know, how have people been collaborating? When did the SART actually begin? So in some cases, the SART started 10 years ago, ran for 5 years, fell apart, and they have gotten back together 2 years ago, but they haven't accomplished anything. That history of knowing that people have tried in the past and it didn't work out, and they're trying again, is utterly critical. I keep saying that. I just wish people, I feel very strongly that all of this is really important, but I'll try to rein in the critical thing. Knowing the history is really, really important because it can help explain some of the dynamics. And the dynamics are coming up in a little bit, so we'll get there shortly. But it's really important to understand. Maybe people don't want to try because they've already tried and failed. Maybe they put a bunch of time, effort, and resources. Or alternatively, maybe your team has done extraordinary things in their time together, and they have a process and a system that works exceptionally well. You're going to want to know that history so that way you can help them continue to do that good work. Or you're going to want to know the other parts of history to be able to know how to navigate some of the work that's happening and to be able to help that team stay focused, keep their meetings meaningful, sustainable, and result in real change together. If you find your team doesn't have any sort of documents to provide history, a great tip, tool, and strategy is to do things like have one-to-one meetings with every single member of your team. Ask them what the history has been. Try to put together a document that, like a one-page overview that describes all of the information about the team that you needed that wasn't there when you were ready to take on the team, right? That's a great way to just say, hey, what's happening? How did we get here? Maybe talking with agency and leadership to find out what's happened. Start to build up those core documents to develop a history if it doesn't already exist for you. Plus, because you're taking time to listen and learn from others, that's going to naturally build some buy-in, relationship, etc. So the next kind of piece to learn about is to really understand what is your team's mission. It's already plugged that we have some tools around mission. Mission is actually one of the most important aspects to making sure a team is meaningful and sustainable. And a mission just answers 3 easy questions. Who are you? What do you do? And who benefits as a direct result? There are so many SARTs that are operating without a clear or agreed upon mission, or they have a mission that takes a full page of text to read and know what it says. And the funny things about missions is that they are your compass as a team. And so if your team isn't clear and able to just rattle off their mission pretty quickly without having to go find a document from 10 years ago, that's an amazing place for you to really learn what have they been doing. So if they didn't have a mission, or they had a mission that was really complicated and long and confusing, how have they been deciding on the work that they've been doing? How have they met their goals? How have they agreed to come together? And you might find that pretty quickly you need a new mission statement, or you need a mission statement at all. And that sort of building, by taking the time to learn, you're really going to be able to build together. And by building a new mission statement, or maybe revising an existing one to really get clear on who you are, what do you do, and who's the direct beneficiary of your work, you can really build a lot of your learning and pull that together in a meaningful way to help your team function better. You will want to take time to learn dynamics. And dynamics are the hard parts of teams because the reality is that SART teams are often highly political. Who gets invited? Who is attending? Do they want to attend, or were they voluntold by a supervisor? Is there agency history from that agency history we joked about that's very, very real? We joke about it because it's really real for people. Myself, when I was a SART coordinator, we have those feelings about other agents, it happens. So what are those dynamics? And then what are the dynamics? You're going to want to take time to really observe in your team. You're going to want to talk to people. Of course, keep your conversations direct, ethical, and collaborative in nature. You do not want to be talking garbage about people behind their backs. So, but you are going to want to kind of explore what are the existing relationships between individuals on my team? What are the relationships between the agencies who are represented as part of this team? What are the dynamics between the disciplines who are participating? What does our previous service and interactions with victim survivors look like. Those kinds of relationship explorations really help you understand the dynamics in which you are working. As a new coordinator, you're really going to also want to look at what are typical interactions. So I tell the story often, but when I first came to my SART team, people didn't speak to each other unless they were in kind of their clique. So my very first team meeting, I showed up bright, bushy-tailed, bubbly, hello everyone, so excited. And people didn't even respond. I would say hello and people didn't speak to me because they didn't really know who I was yet. And they didn't speak to each other. Those dynamics were critical for me to observe and then figure out a plan of action around. And if I had walked in and just said, nope, I'm just going to use my positivity and bubbly personality, get my way through this, I would have missed a lot of really important dynamics-related things that I had to attend to as a SART coordinator to help my team function better. So, with that being said, there are a couple of ways that you can look at dynamics. So you can do a couple of group processes. So one of the ones that I love is to put up a general question, give people the same color of sticky notes, and give people the same color of pens. So those cheap, big stick pens, they're perfect for this. Give people the same color pens, the same color sticky notes. Have them write what's going on for them. Have them respond to that question and then anonymously put their sticky note up. Take that entire piece of paper and talk through, hey, here's what's happening. Here's what we're seeing. Right? That's a way you can really look at it. Look at your core documents. So let's say your team has an amazing documentation. You might see that your team used to have 16 represented agencies, and there are currently only 7 attending. Were they ever removed? Why were they removed? Why did they start and then didn't continue? That's key dynamics information that you can look into as a new coordinator to an existing team. You're also going to want to look at your group's habits. So when I say habits, I mean the very, very concrete stuff of what you actually do together. So one of those key things in habits is what gets done and how. So who's responsible for things like due dates? How do you decide on projects to work on? How do you work through conflict? Because conflict is inevitable in our teams. And most folks say oh, I'm good with conflict, or they're no, I don't want any conflict. There's rarely someone in the middle who's conflict is neither black nor white for me, but a constant shade of gray, right? Most folks either kind of love it or hate it. Knowing how you mediate conflict on your team is really important. Is your team the kind of folks that when conflict comes up, everybody just starts agreeing and just says, yes, that's great, that's great, that's great, and then they walk out of the meeting and nothing happens? Are they the kind of folks that have habits around conflict where people might openly disagree within a meeting and then they go to the parking lot after the meeting to talk about who was wrong and why? Are they the kind of folks where one person dominates the conversation? Those kinds of habits are really important. Other things that you might want to think about, particularly around habits, are, do you have things like an agenda? Who writes the agenda? Who decides what's on there? Who decides when the conversation is over? You also want to look at things like, are there ground rules for how you talk to one another? That was a key thing that I did with my team, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, that we often do with so many coordinators, to just say, how have you agreed to talk to one another? So those are some of those habits that you're really going to want to think about. You're also going to want to think about habits that are concrete, like where do you meet? For how long? What's the purpose of your meeting? Why do you do what you do? So you're going to want to look at assumptions. So especially as a new coordinator on an existing team, you often don't know the assumptions people are carrying. You don't know the ways that they've agreed to work together or not work together when you weren't in the room, when you didn't even exist in your agency, when whatever, right? So you're going to want to look back. Does everyone understand what their team agreements are? Does every single person have a copy of the MOU that outlines the expectations for participation and contribution? Do you know whether your teammates understand the role that they serve as a member of your SART? So often, and I also, this happens for me too, so it happens pretty frequently, we walk in assuming that our team members know that they're there to represent their agency and they're speaking on behalf of an agency. They're not there as like, I don't show up to my SART meeting as me, John Anna Gans, walking in the world wild and free. I'm showing up as John Anna Gans, representative of the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So I'm not speaking for John Anna, I'm speaking for FCJ at MNCASA. I'm speaking for MNCASA. Those kinds of assumptions are super important to talk to your team about. Do they know what the role of their members are? What kind of communication processes have they developed, right? Often a lot of us assume that once we have a SART meeting, they're taking it back to their team, their home agency, talking about what's going on and then bringing that information back. Those assumptions are a great place to explore and learn to be able to then eventually develop the second part, but we'll get there shortly. The last key piece for your learning process is content knowledge. Who serves as an expert and on what? But not just that. Does everyone have the same definition of sexual violence? That has been one of the biggest learning curves that I've had working here at FCJ at MNCASA and traveling all over the U.S. and U.S. territories, is finding out how many folks on the same team have totally different definitions of sexual violence. And so they're trying to do systems change work about very different things, even though they meet at the same meeting every single month and have been for the last 4 years, right? So you want to talk about, what does that content knowledge look like? Do you know, for your community, what the rates of sexual violence reporting are? Is it 1 report every 4 years? Is it 400 reports every 1 year? What does that look like? Who's going to the hospital? Are they able to access hospital services of any kind? Is there law enforcement? That kind of content knowledge, just 101 around sexual violence, and then the specifics around sexual violence, is such an important starting place to truly assess your status quo and learn as a new coordinator to existing teams. So I'm going to pause. Here's a place where you get to chime in and share your wisdom if you have any, and or ask questions if you have any. What other ideas or areas do you think is important to learn about? So Jolene will type this question into the chat box so other people can see it. I'll ask it again. What other areas or ideas do you think it's important to learn about as a new coordinator to an existing team? Part 2 of that question is, do you have any questions based on what I've said so far? So we'll pause quietly for just a minute. Again, Jolene chatted it into the chat box, so for those of you who are like, wait, what? There was a question? It's in your chat box. We'll pause for just 1 second to wait for any answers to be able to crowdsource some ideas together. Ooh, there's some good ones. What do they think we need to make changes on? Absolutely. That's a great question, Lori. And then how much reach each discipline has when it comes to sexual assault. Ooh, there's a couple. How do I take a team that hasn't been project-focused and become project-focused with tangible goals? How do I identify those things? Oh, that's totally going to be part of our development section. In addition, you can always reach out. How can we get advocates in the schools to help with SA? Same as Amanda. Yeah, schools are often a big point. Absolutely. Those are all areas that you can learn, take time to learn, and also maybe start addressing with your team. Confidentiality for each discipline, what they can and cannot talk about. Oh, that's absolutely a critical thing of one of those assumptions. I didn't even address confidentiality because I assumed we'd already know about it, right? And so thank you so much. Confidentiality is critical. What are your confidentiality practices? Are they actually adhering to the guidelines that are out there for each discipline, as well as each funding source? There are tons of confidentiality resources out there. Get a hold of us if you need to know how to find them. How to train the hospitals and law enforcement about sexual assault? Absolutely. That key content knowledge. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing with one another and continuing to ask questions. These are all great areas to continue to learn. We have another one. We invite other outside resources to our monthly meetings, law enforcement. Yep. Okay. Others that become part of our team with each victim we are working with. Awesome. I like it. These are great ideas. So keep an eye on that chat. If you see a suggestion you like, take it and try it with your team and see what happens. It sounds so easy when I say it that way. We know it's a lot harder than that, but at the end of the day, that's all we're really doing is we're trying and seeing what happens in many ways. So thank you so much again, everyone. Okay, so let's talk about developing. This does not have my animations in correctly, so we're going to go one by one. So that's okay. Let's talk about what it means to develop as a coordinator. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about personal style. I am a show up and take charge kind of lady. Jolene is the kind of person who really likes to listen, observe, and learn, right? So our personal styles as SART leaders are going to be vastly different, and that's okay. That's 100%, no questions asked, okay. It's really important, what is really important as you're becoming a new coordinator to an existing team is that you take a hard look at what does your leadership look like? What does your facilitation skills, what do those look like? What is your role and function as a coordinator? What does that look like? And it's really important to understand you're going to be better at some of those things than others. I love leadership and facilitation. I dislike the coordinating part, which is so funny as someone who's been a coordinator for a lot of her life, right? But I know with coordination, I can make it happen, but it's always like the last thing on my list to do. So again, make it happen. What does that look like for you? Are you the kind of big, bold leader who shows up, talks loud, gets a lot of people, like you're charismatic, you get people to get behind an issue with you really quickly? Are you the kind of person who makes really, really deep, meaningful relationships through lots of one-on-one conversation, through how do you learn? Are you an auditory learner? So can you sit in a meeting, hear everything, and remember it later? Do you have to write that stuff down? Those kinds of personal styles, being able to name them, articulate them, and share them with your team helps them adjust to you as a new coordinator. So if I can show up and say, I talk loud, like I don't talk until I'm ready to talk, but when I talk it's going to be like pretty like invested and engaged, and I'm going to come with a lot of energy and passion, right? Being able to say that for people helps them understand that I'm not yelling at them. I'm coming with a lot of energy and passion because I care, right? So figure out what that might look like for you. The next thing is that you're going to want to consider how you develop is new habits. So regardless of how awesome our teams are, and I'm going to go ahead and assume that they're pretty awesome, we all have habits that probably need to change at some point. So maybe a team never had an agenda because they never needed one, but the team has now grown to 14 people instead of 5 people. So maybe you need to develop a new habit with your team of having a written agenda. What are your personal habits? Do you like writing agendas? I secretly do. I don't secretly do. It's actually very public. I enjoy writing an agenda, right? I do not like things like finding a location. I do not like figuring out things like who's going to bring food. That's the kind of stuff I hate. And so that's one of those habits that I have to really, really empower and nurture. If someone around me has that skill set, then I might need to develop a habit of really asking for help around that. You might also look at maybe your team has been meeting to meet for years and they haven't developed those clear goals that some folks are talking about in the chat box. So how do you develop goals? Don't worry, we have resources on that too if you need it. So how are you going to develop your new habits, both you as a SART coordinator and with your team? One of the new habits that I really recommend that was given to me as a brand new coordinator is to 1 week prior to every single meeting send out an agenda, and within 5 business days of every meeting thank people and summarize what they need to do next. It's really critical to just have those kinds of clear communication processes as part of your new habits as a coordinator because it helps people set their expectations. See how I just smoothly transitioned there? As you're thinking about being that new site coordinator, that existing team, you're really going to want to develop expectations. How are you going to build guidelines together? Do you have team agreements? Do you have a team conflict process? Do you have, do you have an expectation that people respond to you within 48 hours? Do you expect yourself to respond? What are those sorts of expectations that you can work through together? Recently, I heard this sentence, and at first I wasn't quite sure I agreed with it, but I've given it a lot of thought over the last couple of weeks, that clear guidelines are trauma-informed. And especially thinking about who's all on our team and thinking about how we adjust to being a new member on a team, we're often working with high rates of trauma, whether primary trauma, secondary, vicarious trauma, right? We're dealing with a lot of trauma. And so building clear expectations, setting boundaries and guidelines can be one of the most trauma-informed things we do. It gives people a container in which they can successfully operate with one another. And so that way people don't feel like the rules are constantly changing. And so maybe you do need to sit down, look at your team's MOU and say, wow, this doesn't reflect anything of what's going on now, and we really have to update this. Or you have to have those conversations with your team and say, how fast do we expect people to respond? How many meetings per year do we expect people to show up to? And if they don't show up, what do we do then? Building out those expectations is not only trauma-informed, it also really helps develop and strengthen relationships on your team. The next aspect to think about is shared vision. So we talked a little bit about mission, dynamics, habits, assumptions, content knowledge, and the learning portion. It's really, really important that you're able to figure out both short-term vision and long-term vision for your team, because that visioning is a key part of the role of the team coordinator. Seeing those bigger goals, developing those action plans, having folks hold them to their agreements. Does everyone know why they're meeting and what the outcome is going to be? Do they know who's responsible for what projects and how those projects contribute directly to systems change? What does the vision look like, and how does it match your mission? Because if your vision for your team's work doesn't actually match your mission, then one of those has to change together. And you do that work together. The next piece is trust. And what we all know is that trust is really hard to build for the most part. Most folks don't walk in trusting everybody right away. One of the best pieces of advice that I can give you, that I was given, is learn to listen fully. Most of the time when we're in conversation, especially if it's about a heated topic about which we feel very passionately, we often aren't listening fully and we're just waiting for our turn to respond. We do things like we interrupt one another. We assume bad intent even when it's not there. We hear feedback and we get defensive immediately. Part of building trust with your team and really developing as a coordinator is being able to demonstrate that you can listen fully, you can take feedback, and you can provide feedback in healthy ways. Trust is really hard because it's not a super concrete thing. And so you're going to have to learn your team. That's part of why we talk about learning first and foremost. Once you better know those dynamics, once you better know those habits and assumptions and content knowledge, you're able to work together to have meaningful conversations and build your trust together. And it's really key to know that you both have to be able to take feedback as a coordinator and provide feedback as a coordinator. And often when I say that, most coordinators have a pretty sharp wall that comes up and they say like, oh, no, you don't know. I can't give my team members feedback about anything. They'll stop coming. That's part of why you want to develop new habits and expectations together. It's part of why you talk about your personal style. That's part of why you did all of that time and effort to learn. So that way you can really come forward and say, here's what I've done to be a good partner in this process. Here's what I need from you to be a good partner in this process. Let's find some common ground and do it together. And of course, the last piece here is really about developing your relationships. Your relationships as a new coordinator on an existing team are created through intentional dialogue. building structures for people, figuring out where are the sticky points, where are the things that people are upset about. Being able to meaningfully and productively surface tension is a key part of building relationships. Being able to say, hey, I served in a meeting. You had a lot of really intense body language. Can we talk about that? Right? Was something happening that you didn't feel like you could participate? Was something happening that was upsetting to you, right? Taking the time to really learn that relationship and really build together is really, really, really one of those key pieces of developing as a SART coordinator. When we're surfacing tension, it's really important to understand that you can't call people out in meetings for the most part. It rarely, if ever, works. Public call-outs are typically just a bad strategy because few folks handle them well. And so part of your relationship building is asking, am I the right person to address this? Maybe there's someone on my team who has an amazing relationship and that person really trusts, respects, and responds to them. Maybe I can somehow work with them to say, hey, can you help me facilitate a conversation together? Use everything you've learned through your process of both learning and developing to be able to act on information in an appropriate way that builds relationships rather than tears them down. Really, truly, part of all of the development process is knowing your skills, knowing your strengths, and knowing your limitations. And being able to really speak to those can help folks feel a great deal of trust in an environment which sometimes struggles with trust. So those are just a few ways that you can develop. We're cruising right along on time, so I'm just going to keep going so we can get to some questions you might have. So the next step is to reflect. And the reflect part is probably ends up being, I'd say it's equal weight. I was going to say I think it's more important, but I don't think it is. So for the reflect part, I'm just going to pose a series of questions that you can be asking yourself as you are working through the learning and developing processes. And these questions are pretty much always ongoing. These are great questions to ask yourself after every team interaction. This is a great question to ask yourself at the beginning of the year, right? There are many ways and places to ask these questions to just constantly be engaging in your own continuous improvement together. Did whatever changes you have made in the developing process, did they work as you hoped them to? If not, why not? What were the barriers? What areas did you have success on those changes? What would have to be different to make those changes as successful as you'd hoped for? So really thinking through, is this what we wanted? You're going to have to ask yourself all the time, what are your unintended consequences? So I'm going to go back to the story that I told about that there were specific groups who were representing marginalized communities, and I wasn't asking them and facilitating in a way that was effective. One of the unintended consequences that I didn't see coming when I started reaching out specifically and only to those providers, I started getting feedback from other members of the team that I didn't value them as much. Now, of course, that was never my design. I was trying to meet a need that I could see that was pointed out to me very lovingly, but also very sharply, because it was necessary. It's important and necessary to take that feedback. I didn't expect that to be a consequence. I didn't think people would worry about it. And so that's how I then had to address what were my unintended consequences. Unintended consequences can also be really positive, right? So I found that by reaching out to a couple of providers, people found out about it. Some folks were a little upset. Other folks said, actually, can I do that too? That was an amazing unintended consequence. I was like, yes, please participate more in my SART. Thank you. So it's a great question to ask. What additional adjustments are needed? And that's just going to be a constant question anyway. You're always going to have to be thinking about, what do I have to do differently? What does my team have to do differently? What do our systems have to do differently to be successful together? Have dynamics changed? If so, how? And if not, why not? What would success look like for the team? When you're thinking about success, I want you to think really, really practically. So the first couple of months with my team, I didn't think about success as amazing meetings where everybody talked and we had these great consensus decision-making models. My first 3 meetings, my monthly meetings, were just, by the end of 3 months, I want people to just be able to greet one another when they walk in the door. That's it. For a while, one of my goals was also, my goal of success was, I would like people to show up at my meeting, right? There were a couple months where people just didn't show up, right? And so I had to really define, what does success look like for our team? I also asked the team, what does success look like for us? That's a great tool and a great reminder just as a human being. One of your best tools, one of your many tools as a new SART coordinator is to just ask the question, right? So often we end up in assumptions and we try to figure out what we think success looks like and what we think other people think success looks like. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just ask. And of course you might get a whole bunch that you didn't want or need, but you're going to get a bunch of information, and that's people caring at you in a real big way. And then the question that should always be on our minds is, how and what will you leave for the next coordinator? So if you're walking into a team as a brand new coordinator and nobody left you anything, make sure to make a plan on how you're going to do it differently. Make sure other people don't have to try to struggle the way that you struggled to fit into your team in a new way. Be that historian for your team. Be that agreement maker for your team. Be that person that you needed. And if someone already gave you that model, follow that model. So we're going to slowly get to the questions, comments, and ideas here. This is my last real content slide for you before we kind of come back to what you need. There are some things to consider when you're a new coordinator to a team. So you might want to think about differing team structures. So we already had a comment from Heather around a co-facilitation model. One of the most beautiful parts of being a SART coordinator is that you have a pretty much limitless number of options on how you want to do it and what your team needs from you on how you do it. So co-facilitation can look like you have 2 people who facilitate the meeting. You might still be doing all the coordination and the big picture leadership, but maybe you have someone on your team who is just an outstanding facilitator who can wrangle people every time. So maybe co-facilitation is a model that works for you. You might want to think about how and where you use subcommittees. One of the big questions people ask us at FCJI and MNCOP all the time is, but how many people is too many people? We have all these people who want to be a part of the team that they don't necessarily fit as a primary point of disclosure or ability to make systems change to our agency policies and practices, but they're really invested. Maybe a subcommittee is right. Maybe you have a whole bunch of colleges and universities in your area that really want to talk about sexual assault on campus, but it's making it challenging to hold the team to the core mission or projects that they're working on. That's a great opportunity for a subcommittee. Have a campus subcommittee. There are a whole bunch of ways you can do that. There's also advisory councils. So we talk pretty consistently about victim survivors participating in our teams through things like subcommittees or advisory councils. So the advisory council is far less structured and far less consistent than a subcommittee as a whole. Subcommittees are usually meeting regularly. They have one member who's a liaison from that subcommittee coming back to the main team. For the advisory council, it's usually the team coordinator or another designated team representative who goes to the council, shares information, collects the information, and then comes back as the designated representative for that council. So council members rarely sit on our teams. They might only be formed for a 6-month period because you are working through a victim survivor experience survey and you need a victim survivor advisory council. So you have those folks meet every couple of months for 6 months, and then they disband because it's not needed anymore. You might also do that with different folks. A number of the areas that we work with, faith is a real, faith communities are so important as points of disclosure. They might not have time or comfort sitting on a SART, but could you have a faith leaders advisory council to help you work through some big questions? Certainly. Those differing team structures are truly just limited by our creativity and ingenuity. Figure out what works for you and your team. Have that space, and then make it happen. And then, if it doesn't work, you can say, wow, we tried that and it didn't work, and try something new. Often we get so discouraged when things don't work out how we'd hoped that we stop trying. The key thing with SART, as we talked about from the very beginning, is it's a continuous improvement model, so you just try again. Make sure you're planning for how you're orienting your new team members. Do you have things like a buddy system? Do you have written documentation from the former person who was in that position? Do you have a team orientation document that you wrote together? There's a million ways to do it. And then, above all, plan for transition. It is an absolute and only guarantee of our SART work. So we said we weren't going to do any guarantees. This is pretty much the only one I will give you. Transition is going to happen on your team. How are you planning for it right now, 6 months from now, and 5 years from now? So, with that, we have come to the end of all of the content I have to provide you. I would love to hear any questions, comments, or ideas that have been sparked. Most folks often jump off the call right now, but what I find is that this opportunity to share is so important. So, if you have some general questions you want us to answer, if you have ideas for one another, share them in the chat. I'll drop silence for just a minute and give folks a minute to share anything that they have. One of the questions, while y'all are thinking for a few minutes, one of the big questions that we had at the beginning that I want to address, a number of you actually had a lot of questions about how do you get buy-in? And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the strategies we have seen folks use to get buy-in and the way that they are helpful. So, one key thing that you can do to get buy-in, especially from law enforcement and prosecution, is to be able to describe what you're doing and why. So we talked about this already with mission, but there are so many folks who there isn't a clear mission. And so when they're asking a lot from prosecutors or law enforcement, or even if they're asking very little, folks might say like, oh, we don't have time for that, we can't do that, it's not, in our scope. If I came to you and said, hey, can you give me $500 for a really important project? And you don't know me that well, you as an agency might not want to commit to $500 for a project you know nothing about. I think if you can come, and not I think, this is pretty frequent, if you can come to law enforcement and prosecution and say, here is our exact mission, here is our scope of work, here are the projects we're going to be working on for the next 6 months with the outcomes we have expected from them, that's a very different. So if I came to you and said all those things, I need $500 to be able to do X, Y, and Z by these dates, which will have these outcomes. Your agency might not know me, but you might be more willing to really say, hey, I'll give you that money because I believe in the project that you have provided, because you have demonstrated that you know what you're doing and how and why. So that's a really key thing to think about when you're thinking about the structure of your SART. Other buy-in issues can be, is it the right time and date for that agency? So there was one community that I worked with where the city or the county hub was a relatively square-ish, because county lines. It was a square-ish county. The county hub was in the lower right-hand corner. The advocacy agency was up in the upper left-hand corner of the county. So everyone else had the team meeting in the lower right-hand corner in the county hub and seat, because that's where most people were, which means advocacy rarely, if ever, showed up because they didn't have the time or the funds to constantly drive back and forth for every SART meeting. So the team was describing not having buy-in from advocacy, when in reality it was because there was a limitation of when they were meeting and where they were meeting. So look at your time and date. Is every Thursday or every fourth Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. when your prosecutor actually has cases that go to trial, right? Is your law enforcement able to make it because they only have 2 people in the sheriff's office on shift at a time together and they can't afford to send one person out? Those kinds of things can be really, really key in thinking about your buy-in related issues. There are lots of other things, but I see a question has come in, so I'm going to pause and read it out loud for everyone. What is a good way to transition from the old coordinator to me being the new coordinator? An employee is leaving our office and did this her way, and I'd like a smooth transition. That's a great question. I have often found that, especially with transitions between coordinators, is really being able to sit down and talk and say, hey, in looking back, what went really well? What was an area of struggle? Why did you see those areas of struggle? Why did you think that the area went really well? And be able to have that conversation one-to-one. If you can't have that conversation, so when I left being a SART coordinator, they had not hired a new SART coordinator. I left like a 5-page single-space document that has details down to like, on this date at this time every month you will need to go pick up snacks. On this date at this time every month you're going to want to send out your agenda, sample attached, right? And that person could follow it or drop it in any way, shape, or form that she saw it. Ultimately ended up being a woman who took it after me. She was able to just pick up and use it, drop what didn't work for her, and figure out her own process. So you can do a lot of things like that. You can also talk to your team members. Do one-on-ones. Take the time and schedule. Go meet in a neutral location if you can, or meet at their office rather than yours and say, hey, I would like to talk about how we move forward together. What is one thing you would like to see changed about our SART meetings? What is one thing you would like to stay the same? That process is so, so beneficial. So those are some of those ways that you can do it. Also, make sure you're including, wherever possible, your supervisor within the agency, because your supervisor is the one who's supposed to be able to help support and back you doing systems change work with a SART. So maybe your supervisor has ideas or comments or feedback. So you might want to check in and say, hey, supervisor and other person, let's talk about what this looks like. How do we do this together? So that's just a couple quick ideas. Of course, anyone who's on the chat, if you have ideas to answer these questions, feel free to toss out some ideas, because this is truly a space of learning together. So we have another question. I co-facilitate a tri-county SART team with 3 different counties. Ooh, yep. Those individual counties have their own SART meetings as well. What tips do you have for maintaining motivation and setting goals on a larger scale? Should this have more of an emphasis on systems procedures as opposed to individual practices? So because you have 3 separate SARTs, you might want to actually build up the purpose and scope of each individual SART, but then perhaps you have like a leadership advisory council between all 3 counties. So maybe you have 2 folks from each SART be willing to show up and say, what are we doing in this entire tri-county area? What kind of goals, what do we want victim survivors to be able to say, no matter which county they received services in or sought help? So you might want to do that. You could also think about doing like a tri-county subcommittee, or like an advisory board, if you will. I'm trying to think, Jillian, do you have anything else? The tri-county? Because, of course, we're just kind of spitballing now. I'll let you think about it, and I'll go to the next question. You can come back, don't worry. How would you suggest to overcome a lack of trust between SART members due to previous events? Oh, you're so in it, Danielle, with so many other folks are there, too. I'm part of a SART that was not functioning very well and is working to become better. A number of participants want to do case reviews to determine what our county can do better, but no one will provide a case to review for fear how this will be handled and how feedback is provided.
Do you want to talk briefly about just broadly how did you trust, and then I can tackle a little bit about the case?
Awesome, yes. So you look at us collaborating like fools, like awesome rock stars, not fools. So if there has been some sort of specific precipitating event, I would highly recommend working through that with your team. So maybe that looks like a couple of the suggestions I've given. Maybe you put together an anonymous survey where people can share any information. Maybe you work with your local county, like a mediator's office or an ombudsman. I can never say that word. Ombudsman's office. So folks who truly are there to help people mediate conflict. Or in some cases, sometimes you have to just be able to say, okay, anyone who's affected by this event, we're going to hold a special team meeting, like a special meeting, to try to work through how do we move past this. You can also really look at lack of trust, doing something like a half-day retreat together, where you lay out your goals, your plans for the year, you put together an action plan, you revise your mission if that's what needs to happen, you develop new team agreements. For my team, about 6 months into being their coordinator, we wrote together a set of team agreements with what it looks like. So that was one of the ways that we tackled some of the challenges in communications with one another. So there's a lot of ways that you can look at that trust. So Danielle, you can always reach out and talk with us more specifically if this is not meeting your need, and others, same to you. Jolene, do you want to tackle some case review stuff?
Yeah. And before I start talking about that, I think one of the other key things is sometimes just moving forward with integrity, like as a team, like depending on what has happened in the past, like start to just rebuild the team by showing that things can be different now and starting to pull away from some of those old habits and some of those old communication dynamics that John Anna had talked about before, and really just show the team that help to rebuild those relationships by moving forward with integrity. When it comes to like case review and teams that are not wanting to put forward live cases, because it's an incredibly vulnerable time for teams to kind of put forward their own work to be kind of picked apart, and depending on the relationships, it can be rough. And we have seen teams doing case review cause like a lot of harm within teams. But I still feel it's such an incredibly valuable strategy. And I think that one of the ways, especially if there have been some concerns in the past about that trust and using live cases, I'd say one of my favorite things to do is have the team just map the system's response. I think we have some wonderful exercises within our own resources that we're definitely willing to share, because I think that by truly taking the time to map through the resources, you're able to use scenarios and look at those different points and learn from other team members about like what their role actually entails, and also what are those, most importantly for me, like what are those cross collaboration points, or what are those areas where you all need to learn more together. And I think that mapping as a team can really just build a lot of future things for future activities, and so I'd recommend that. There also, with case review in particular, before doing live cases, I would even recommend doing mock cases. And we have a few here that are available for people to use, but it can really help people think about what are the frameworks that people are going into when they are processing through cases, what are things that are done differently in your community that might have been done within that mock review, but at least provide some sort of place to start from. And if you can start to practice some of those healthy communication patterns, then people might be more willing to bring forward some of those live cases or some of those closed cases that really went well to kind of start to build from there. And so we can, Danielle, I'm definitely willing, case file review is one of those things that really excites me to talk about, so I'm really willing to work with you and offline, but those are just some strategies off the cuff. So
we are officially on Central Time at 2:31, so we are at time. The last thing I really want to say before I turn it over to Jolene for the last minute logistics and goodbyes is, and this is going to sound real touchy-feely, I never thought I'd say something like this, but I'm doing it. Our work as SART coordinators is to instill the idea of hope in our teams and the agencies that they represent. We often come together because we know that there are problems, and we see what has to change. And oftentimes we get a lot of feedback that it can't change. And so as a new coordinator, as an existing coordinator, as an old pro, at the end of the day, our business is instilling hope and action based on that hope. And so if you need help instilling hope in others, wow, those are a lot of those words. If you need help to instill hope in others, or maybe just in yourself, please reach out to us. We have a whole bunch of tools and resources. We will connect you to other TA providers. We will help you get wherever you need to go. So with that, thank you so much for being here. Jolene?
Yep, echoing what John Anna was just saying, thank you so much for taking your time today to listen here live, or for those of you who are listening to this recording, we really appreciate you taking that time as well. On our website, we have a lot of our core materials that you can definitely feel free to use and modify and take and do what you need to do to make it work for your community. We also do host the SART blog focusing on rural SART and some of those kind of key concepts. And please read that. Both of our contact information is listed. My phone number apparently did get cut off, but please email me, and we can definitely be in contact. And if there's other things that you might be interested in terms of like a training for your own community, or a resource that you might need, or a future webinar that you think would be super beneficial for a lot of different sort of SART coordinators, we love feedback. We love creating new things, and we love exploring with you to kind of wrestle through what are those unique conversations that happen in your community. So after this recording, we'll be working on getting everything captioned, and then we'll send out that link afterwards so that you can kind of go have this back as reference. And I would say you can look for it on our website probably after that is all taken care of. So please, thank you again for attending, and don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you.
Bye, everybody.